Hello and welcome, or welcome back to Language Culture and Dr. Lou. And today I'd like to talk about some quotations that we have that a lot of us still sometimes use as idioms, but we might forget where they came from. And a lot of these quotes here, they really defined pivotal moments and pivotal parts of the nature of the 20th century. And so I'd like to really go through some of them with you today. I think they're very much worth it because, of course, the 20th century was defined by a lot of things, namely wars, the two world wars, and of course, the war in Vietnam. And let's not forget the Cold War, to name just a few going on. And as well as we had the civil rights movement go on in the US, striving towards racial equality, as well as the place of women in Western society changed a lot in the 20th century. And so all of those things are worth mentioning. And so, what quotes am I talking about? To start, we'll start with one that I didn't remember exactly where this quote came from, but I hear it all the time. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so, what was the context for that? This was said by FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who he was, of course, first governor of New York State and then won the presidency. And he inherited the problems of the Great Depression. And so Franklin D. Roosevelt, when trying to get push forth his New Deal to put Americans back to work and to fix the economy and all that, he needed the people to be on board with that. He needed people to stop being just worrying so much and maybe help make the place better. And so this was part of one speech that he made had this line to it. Yeah, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which I really do love um, that he was counting on Americans to work together and better the country. And he said, "Yeah, don't be afraid. If we work on this, we will make this happen." And although the sad thing about this is one thing he didn't know, if you remember, FDR was president for nearly 12 years, the longest one in American history. And he would also end up inheriting World War II as well. So in 1933, he didn't see that coming yet. But that's one irony behind this quote, which was about the New Deal and recovering from the Great Depression. But ironically, there was World War II to fear at the end of that same decade, at the end of the 1930s and into the 40s. And so, yeah, so that's ironic that way. And so, speaking of World War II, you also have Winston Churchill, who at the time was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And he said, "We shall never surrender." And what's he talking about? He was talking about when, well, a lot of people were looking towards him to make a peace deal with Adolf Hitler to keep Great Britain safe and all that. And he had other thoughts. Like his idea was just not doing anything to appease Hitler because they were already, well, the Nazis were already bad enough. Um, and he wanted to make sure that the United Kingdom could just keep hanging in there until the US could join the war. And so he goes with, "We shall never surrender," which I think that's a nice quote because it applies in a lot of contexts. But what it was about originally was the United Kingdom not in any way surrendering to Adolf Hitler and his Nazis. And so, yeah, that is one one thing we should really not forget about. And also related to World War II and just along the end of it, which it was in fact the beginning of the Cold War as well. Right around that time, you had Mao Zedong, who said the atom bomb is a paper tiger. And of course, what's a paper tiger is something that looks a whole lot more dangerous than it actually is. And so, why is he referring to the A bomb? Which we had already seen do some real damage to Hiroshima and Nagasaki already, and he's calling it a paper tiger. Well, I think he meant originally by it was that governments rely on the support of their people, of their citizens, and no citizens would support the use of atomic weapons, of nuclear weapons, because it's not good for, well, anybody. And some people kind of misinterpreted this a little bit to say that he what he possibly meant was that was a reference to the Cold War, and he was implying that no government would actually use an A bomb because everybody loses. If you get into an actual nuclear war, then everybody loses. So it's a zero sum. Well, it's a zero win game. Everybody loses. But really, he was more talking about how governments rely on the support of their people, and no citizens would be okay with this kind of thing. But yeah, so and that also kind of references, yeah, the Cold War, all the tensions between the USSR and the USA, and they both had this threat to loom over each other's heads. Oh, we could nuke you, we've got A bombs and all that. And Chairman Mao was just sort of, oh, it's a paper tiger, nobody's going to do it. So I think that's certainly worthy of inclusion in this list of quotes that really define the 20th century. And so, not too long after that, we're already into the 1960s, and we had Cassius Clay at the time who said, I am the greatest. And in a way, he was totally right about that because in 1960, he won an Olympic gold medal where he came in first for the light heavyweight division in boxing at the Olympics. So in that way, he was the greatest. He was an Olympic gold medalist at the time when he did this, but he was also a really self-promoting poet and a bit of a trash talker as well. And so he actually in 1963 he released an album of rhythmically spoken poetry called "I Am the Greatest." And this can be attributed to Cassius Clay under that name because I believe it wasn't until 1964 that he announced his conversion to Islam and his name changed to Muhammad Ali. And even in that time, he was about to end up, well, risking jail time and all this. He ended up being seen as a figurehead in the civil rights movement and in the American citizens' disdain for the war in Vietnam as well. Like his case went all the way to the Supreme Court because he was refusing to fight in that war. So people remembered him for that, and some identified with him for that. And he also reminds me he's a figure we should certainly take into account for big things in the 20th century because, again, he was against the war in Vietnam. Also, he was a figurehead in the civil rights movement, seeking for more and more racial equality in the US. And on top of that, he's one of many African American athletes um, who ended up finding stardom and really getting to the very top of all the ranks in professional sports in the United States. I mean, just before him, a little bit before him in the 40s and 50s, you had Jackie Robinson, who played for the Brooklyn Dodgers and broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. and of course, uh, boxing had for quite some time been one way for the poorer people to end up getting, well, making better of themselves. And so he certainly did that. And so, by the way, while Jackie Robinson was playing baseball, Cassius Clay here was probably seeing that as a little kid, thinking, hey, I could be a professional athlete too. And again, at the age of 18, he already won a gold medal in boxing. So I think he deserved to be saying, I'm the greatest. And again, Muhammad Ali was also seen as an important figurehead in the civil rights movement. And in the same year, 1963, is when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his iconic I Have a Dream speech, which was all about America ending segregation and racial inequality and helping all live together. That was a beautiful dream he had, and that one should really not be forgotten. And fittingly, this was in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington D.C. And I say fittingly because, of course, Abraham Lincoln was the one who signed the Emancipation Proclamation and all of that. Anyway, um, so the 1960s were a really big year of social and cultural, I mean, a big decade for social and cultural change in the United States and elsewhere. And again, the war in Vietnam started raising as well. Excuse me. And that brings me to the Beatles, which must be recognized as one of the most influential music groups of the 20th century. And 1967, you might remember, was that summer was known as the Summer of Love. And the Beatles were certainly part of that. They put out that year, a little earlier before the summer, they came out with um, Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, that album. And a featured single on the album was All You Need Is Love. And this is a beautiful song. The lyrics are very simple. All you need is love. Love is free. Love is all you need, and so on. And so they were very much a part of, yeah, uh, not just not just turning against the older generation and what they expected people's actions to be like, flipping that on its head, and not just part of the big drug doing scene that was going on back then, but they were also part of spreading the message of love, that love is all you need. And so, yeah, I had to include them in this, of course. And so I also wanted to mention in the 1960s, that's when man landed on the moon, right? That's important. Although some people to this day still think the moon landing was staged, like it was a hoax and whatnot, but I don't know about that. I believe it was real anyway. And and of course, Neil Armstrong was recorded saying that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. And yeah, he did say for a man. Sometimes that gets misquoted. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It was for a man. He was talking about himself taking that step on the moon. And and of course, Buzz Aldrin, who was also on that mission with him, gets a little less credit because he didn't happen to be the exact first astronaut to step out on the moon. He was second, but still. Um, and yeah, so that's big thing. Nice way to end the 60s. Although sadly, the war in Vietnam was still going on, but nice way to cap off that decade where people are fighting for civil rights and for equality and against the oppressions of war and all that. And we finally made it all the way to the moon. And so Neil Armstrong will live in our hearts forever for that. And another big thing that happened over the course of the 20th century, like I mentioned before, is how the place of women changed a lot in Western civilization. And so this goes back to a quote by Hillary Clinton, Hillary Rodham Clinton to be specific, and what she said in this at this conference, this International Conference on Women, I think it was called. Um, she was making an address and she said, human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. And that's very true. Of course, women are humans, right? Um, and equality among genders is, in my opinion, good for all of us. And I wanted to make sure to include a quotation about feminism and the women's rights movement and all that, because one thing that women earned the right to do in the United States in I think it was in the 1920s, was to vote. Before that, before the 20th century, women were not even allowed to vote in the US. And that was a big change, as well as all these changes of women in the workforce, women taking over a lot of professions that had traditionally only been done by men, and all of that. So a lot of progress among gender equality, just like progress on racial equality, both were really defining aspects of the 20th century. So thank you so much for watching this list of quotes that define the 20th century. If you can think of one that you think really defines something important, some important cultural change in the 21st century, I mean, the 20th century, please do leave it in the comments. I would love to hear it and I would love to discuss. So yeah, let's discuss it in the comments. And please do as well, give this video a thumbs up. Please drop a like on it. And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, please consider subscribing. That would mean a lot to me and I would appreciate it very much. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to you in the next video. And so until then, catch you around next time. Bye bye.